The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 63, Sovereign Living Choosing Freedom over Performance. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. For most of us, life begins on a stage. We learn the roles expected of us, the lines to repeat, the gestures that earn approval. We perform to fit in, to survive, to belong. And for a time, it works. Performance buys us safety, attention, even love. But somewhere along the way, we feel the cost. Performance asks us to trade pieces of ourselves for acceptance. It asks us to polish our edges, mute our voice, and wear masks so convincing that we sometimes forget what's underneath. This episode is about something different. Sovereignty. Not sovereignty as domination or control, but sovereignty as freedom, the courage to live without a script, to choose authenticity over approval, to be guided by inner authority instead of external performance. In this episode, we'll explore the masks we wear and how performance shapes our lives, the cost of performance, the cage that keeps us safe but small, what sovereignty really means beyond control or power, the practices of sovereignty in daily life, walking without a script, sovereignty in relationship and society, freedom together, not apart, and finally, sovereign living as a path, not a crown we wear, but a way we walk. Sovereignty is not about being untouchable. It's about being real, and reality is always where freedom is found. Let's begin the masks we wear from the beginning. We are taught to perform. We learn early which words earn smiles and which bring punishment. We learn which emotions are safe to express and which must be hidden. Over time, this becomes second nature, not just something we do, but something we are. Performance is not always malicious. Sometimes it helps us survive. But the longer we wear masks, the harder it becomes to know who we are beneath them. Themes, the stage of approval. Life often feels like a theatre, where approval is the ticket to belonging. The mask as protection masks are not only lies, they are shields. They help us survive environments that cannot hold our truth. The disappearance of self. The danger comes when performance replaces authenticity, when the mask becomes indistinguishable from the face. The awakening moment. Eventually, many of us feel the dissonance, the sense that the role we are playing no longer fits, and the mask begins to suffocate. Attributes performative. Masks show what is acceptable, not what is real. Protective. They guard us from rejection or punishment. Deceptive. Masks distort truth, even when they protect. Exhausting. Sustaining performance drains energy and erodes authenticity. The stage of approval. I imagine life as a grand stage. Each of us was handed a costume, a script, and a set of lines rehearsed for approval. We bow, we smile, we deliver our cues. But behind the curtain, another self waits, silent, unseen, longing for air. Sociologist Irving Goffman described social life as performance, each of us playing roles in front of an audience, adjusting our masks to match the setting. I've seen how true that feels. We learn to be different versions of ourselves in different places. At home, at work, in friendships, in spiritual spaces. The mask is not always false. Sometimes it is a fragment of us, polished and presented, but it is rarely the whole. And the more time we spend in performance, the easier it is to forget what the unmasked self feels like. Performance might keep us safe, but it costs us authenticity, personal reflection. When I think back to my childhood, I see how performance shaped me from the beginning. In My Inner Child Was Broken, I wrote about how I learned to read people carefully, sensing what version of myself was acceptable to avoid punishment or rejection. That sensitivity kept me safe, but it also taught me to silence parts of myself. Later in life, I saw the same pattern play out in society. In the Inversiverse, I explored how cultural conditioning trains us to self-police, to moderate our language, to suppress what doesn't fit. I noticed it in the way people around me would say things like, "Oh, you can't say that now," or "I shouldn't be saying this." The mask wasn't just personal, it was cultural, a performance everyone seemed to know they were part of. For me, the hardest part was realizing that I had worn the mask for so long, I sometimes wasn't sure where performance ended and I began. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, I've noticed how masks form out of necessity. A child who hides their anger or tears to avoid punishment learns that performance is safer than truth. But later, that same performance becomes a prison. Psychologists describe this as the false self, Winnicott's idea that we adapt to survive, but lose touch with the true self beneath. At the group level, performance becomes culture. I've been in groups where masks were mandatory. Everyone smiling, speaking the right words, performing positivity while the real struggles stayed hidden. It looked harmonious, but it was brittle. The moment honesty broke through, the mask of the whole group shattered. At the societal level, performance becomes ideology. Nations, religions, and systems of power teach us scripts, what to say, what to believe, what to display, while punishing dissent. I saw this clearly as I grew up in a culture where language itself was policed. Performance wasn't just expected, it was demanded. I've learned that masks begin as protection, but over time they cost us our freedom. Embodiment, prompt, or practice. Take a few breaths. Place your hands over your face. Whisper the words, "This is the mask I wear." Then slowly lower your hands. Whisper, "This is me beneath the mask." Notice how it feels to acknowledge both. Insight prompt. What mask do you find yourself wearing most often, and what would it mean to let it slip even a little? Integration moment. Masks help us survive, but they cannot help us live freely. To begin sovereign living, we must first recognize the masks we wear, and the price we pay for keeping them on. Seed to plant. The mask protects, but it also imprisons. Sovereignty begins when we dare to breathe beneath it. The cost of performance. Masks keep us safe, but safety always has a price. Performance promises belonging, but the belonging it buys is conditional. We get acceptance, but only for the role, not for the person behind it. Over time, the cost becomes heavy. Exhaustion, disconnection, and the slow erosion of freedom. Themes. The cage with velvet walls. Performance feels comfortable at first. We are protected, even rewarded, but comfort hides confinement. Belonging without recognition. The mask earns us belonging, but only for the part we perform. The self underneath remains unseen. The toll of pretense. Living inauthentically drains energy and erodes confidence. Pretense becomes fatigue. The crisis point. Eventually, the mask cracks. The dissonance between who we are and who we pretend to be becomes unbearable. Attributes conditional. Acceptance depends on staying in character. Draining. Performance requires constant vigilance. Alienating. It disconnects us from ourselves and from others. Unsustainable. Eventually, the mask begins to break. The cage with velvet walls. I imagine performance like a cage lined with velvet. It's soft, padded, and even comfortable. But a cage is still a cage, and the longer we stay inside it, the smaller we become. The danger of performance is not obvious at first. Wearing the mask seems to work. We get praise, belonging, and safety. But I've learned that what is rewarded is not me, it's the mask. And living that way slowly hollowed me out. Donald Winnicott spoke of the false self, the adapted identity children create to survive. It protects, but it also buries the true self beneath. I felt that reality firsthand. Performance carried me for years, but it also left me asking, who would I be if I stopped pretending? The cost of performance is not just exhaustion, it is invisibility, personal reflection. One of the things I've noticed about performance is how it doesn't just silence me, it drains me. I can remember times in adult life where I walked into a room already rehearsing who I needed to be. The conversation wasn't spontaneous, it was calculated. What's safe to say here? How should I hold myself? By the time I left, I felt tired, not because of the people themselves, but because of the energy it took to keep the mask in place. I've also seen how performance crept into spirituality. There were circles where I felt I had to speak the right words, show the right posture, even display the right emotions to prove I was growing. It wasn't freedom, it was theatre. And deep down, I knew the difference. What struck me most, though, was realizing that people often loved the mask more than the person. They were comfortable with the role I played, but unsettled when I showed up raw. That recognition hurt because it revealed that some of the belonging I thought I had wasn't real. It was rented, conditional, based on performance. For me, the cost of performance has always been energy wasted and connections that never touched the real me. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, I've experienced performance as slow erosion. I could survive but not thrive. Psychologists have linked chronic inauthenticity with anxiety, depression, and burnout, all symptoms of the body rebelling against a life lived in disguise. I know the exhaustion of this all too well. At the group level, I've seen how performance makes relationships brittle. Groups that reward conformity create shallow bonds. People belong, but only as long as they maintain the act. The moment someone shows raw honesty, the illusion of harmony shatters. I've witnessed this happen. The group becomes fragile because the belonging was conditional. At the societal level, I've noticed how entire systems profit from performance. Schools, workplaces, and governments reward those who follow the script. Citizens who self police are easier to control. But the cost is authenticity on a mass scale. When people are reduced to performers, societies lose their ability to grow. For me, the cost of performance is the price of freedom traded away, often so subtly that we don't notice until the mask begins to suffocate us. Embodiment prompt or practice. Take a deep breath. Ask yourself, what part of me is performing right now? Notice the tension in your body. Where does the act live? Allow your shoulders to drop, your jaw to unclench. Let one mask slip even slightly. Insight prompt. What role in your life feels most like a velvet cage, comfortable but confining? What would it cost you to take one step toward freedom? Integration moment performance buys belonging, but the price is authenticity. Sooner or later, the cage of performance reveals itself, velvet lined or not. It is still a prison. Sovereignty begins when we recognize the cost and decide it's too high. Seed to plant belonging without recognition is not freedom. Sovereignty starts where the mask ends. What sovereignty really means. If performance is the mask and its cost is invisibility, sovereignty is the opposite, the return to visibility, to authenticity, to self-rule. But sovereignty is a word often misunderstood, mistaken for domination, control, or standing above others. In truth, it is something quieter, deeper, and more personal. The authority to be guided by your own inner truth, not by the scripts handed to you. Themes sovereignty as self-rule. At its root, sovereignty means authority over one's own life, living by inner compass rather than external approval. Awakening from sleep sovereignty is also an awakening. Across languages, Sova carries echoes of sleep and dream. To be sovereign is to awaken from the dream of conditioning, to live consciously rather than unconsciously. Beyond domination, true sovereignty isn't about power over others, but power with oneself, the ability to live aligned, unmasked, uncoerced. The inner crown's sovereignty is not a crown given by others. It is the crown within, discovered when we awaken to our own truth. Attributes autonomous, guided from within, not dictated from without. Awakened, alert, conscious, refusing the sleep of conditioning. Empowering, sovereignty gives energy rather than drains it. Sacred, a reclamation of human dignity and spirit. The crown within I imagine sovereignty as a crown not worn for display, but carried within. It doesn't glitter for others to see. It steadies me when I am tempted to fall back asleep. The word sovereignty comes from Old French souveraineté, and further back from Latin superanus, above, supreme. Traditionally, it described rulers, nations, and authority over territory. But there's another way to hear the word. In several languages, sova, sova, sonya carry the resonance of sleep and dream. When I think of sovereignty through that lens, it becomes more than political authority. It becomes spiritual. To regain sovereignty is to awaken from the sleep of conditioning, to reclaim the authority over one's own life that was numbed or stolen. For me, sovereignty has never been about ruling others. It has been about waking up, stepping out of the dream of performance, of indoctrination, of masks, and remembering that I carry my own authority. Personal reflection. My own awakening was the moment I began to recognize sovereignty. It wasn't a single flash, but a series of realizations. I saw how much of my life had been shaped by scripts handed to me, by family, by culture, by government, by spirituality itself. I thought I was awake, but I was still performing. It was only when disillusionment cracked me open that I began to wake. I noticed the ways people around me were asleep too, repeating slogans, self-policing their language, numbing their feelings. And I knew I didn't want to live that way anymore. Claiming sovereignty felt like reclaiming sight. Once I saw it, I couldn't go back to sleep. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, sovereignty means stepping out of the false self. Winnicott's true self can only emerge when the mask falls. For me, this meant listening to my intuition and trusting my awareness, even when it contradicted the comfort of staying asleep. At the group level, sovereignty often clashes with conformity. I've felt the pull to shrink myself to fit in, but I've also seen how communities that honor sovereignty, that allow people to speak truth without punishment, foster real belonging. Hannah Arendt described freedom not as isolation, but as the courage to act authentically in public. That insight continues to resonate with me. At the societal level, sovereignty is often manipulated. Nations talk of sovereignty while suppressing individual freedom. Systems encourage performance, not authenticity, because performance is predictable. I've written in the Inversiverse about how governments and corporations thrive on populations asleep, compliant, conditioned, dreaming someone else's dream. To wake up is itself an act of rebellion. For me, sovereignty has always felt less like a crown and more like an alarm clock, a call to wake up, to live awake, to refuse the sleep of illusion. Embodiment prompt or practice close your eyes. Whisper, where am I still asleep? Breathe deeply, imagining yourself waking up not just from slumber, but from conditioning. Place your hand on your chest and whisper, I carry the crown within. Insight prompt. Where in your life are you still performing, still asleep in someone else's script? What would it mean to awaken into your own sovereignty? Integration moment sovereignty is not domination, nor is it perfection. It is awakening, a refusal to live asleep, a courage to carry your own crown within, and a commitment to choose freedom over performance. Seed to plant sovereignty is awakening. To live sovereignly is to wake from the dream and choose your own life. The practices of sovereignty is not only an idea, it is a way of living. Every day offers us choices, to perform or to be real, to follow the script or to speak with our own voice, to drift back into sleep or to stay awake. Sovereignty is not a crown to wear once, it is a practice renewed in these daily moments. Theme sovereignty in speech, to speak without polishing or censoring truth, not recklessly, but honestly. Sovereignty in choice, to act from inner alignment, even when it defies expectation or approval. Sovereignty in relationship, to meet others as equals, not performers. Sovereignty honors connection without erasing individuality. Sovereignty as resistance. To live awake in a culture of sleep is itself resistance, choosing presence where illusion is rewarded. Attributes authentic, sovereignty refuses pretense in word and action. Aligned, decisions reflect inner truth, not external pressure. Relational, sovereignty respects others without collapsing into conformity. Resistant, sovereignty resists systems of performance and control. Walking without a script, I imagine sovereignty as walking through life without a script in hand. The lines aren't rehearsed. The stage directions aren't dictated. Every step is chosen, not performed. Sovereignty can sound abstract until you start noticing the small ways it shows up. In conversation, it's the decision to speak truth instead of the safe script. In work, it's choosing integrity over compliance. In relationships, it's daring to show up as yourself rather than who you think the other person wants. Philosophers like Kierkegaard framed this as authenticity, to choose yourself instead of living by the crowd. For Hannah Arendt, freedom was not retreating from the world, but acting authentically within it. For me, both resonate. Sovereignty is personal, but it is not private. It's how we walk among others, awake, unmasked. Personal reflection. I felt sovereignty most clearly in the moments I resisted indoctrination. There were times when I sensed I was being handed a script, in politics, in religion, in spirituality, and something inside me said no. At first, I thought resistance made me difficult or defiant, but later I realized it was sovereignty, the refusal to sleepwalk through someone else's story. I've also experienced sovereignty in simple choices, trusting intuition when it contradicted the rational path, speaking honestly even when silence would have been safer, saying, this isn't for me, when the pressure was to conform. Those choices weren't grand gestures, but they felt like acts of reclamation, reminders that my life belongs to me. For me, sovereignty has been less about a single awakening and more about daily practice, 1,000 small decisions to stay awake. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, sovereignty is about aligning action with truth. Psychologists call this congruence. when our outer life matches our inner reality. I know the fatigue of incongruence, and I've also felt the energy that returns when I live aligned. At the group level, sovereignty reshapes relationships. I've been in friendships where performance was expected, but also in rare connections where honesty was allowed. Those sovereign spaces were liberating. I didn't have to perform, and neither did they. That kind of connection feels rare, but it's real. At the societal level, sovereignty disrupts systems built on conformity. Cultures thrive when people stay asleep, self-policing their words, rewarding each other for compliance. Sovereignty interrupts that cycle. It doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to nod along or quietly choosing a different path. That choice is powerful because it proves the script isn't absolute. For me, the practice of sovereignty is where awakening becomes lived, in speech, choice, and presence. Embodiment prompt practice. Think of a recent situation where you felt pressure to perform. Reimagine it. What would sovereign speech or action have looked like? Notice how your body responds as you picture choosing differently. Insight prompt. What is one area of your daily life, speech, choice, or relationship where you could practice sovereignty this week? Integration moment. Sovereignty is not an abstract crown but a lived practice. Every word, every choice, every act of honesty is an act of sovereignty. To live sovereign is to walk unscripted, awake, aligned, free. Seed to plant sovereignty is not declared once. It is chosen daily in every act of truth. Sovereignty in relationship and society. It's easy to mistake sovereignty for isolation, as though being sovereign means standing alone, detached, needing no one. But sovereignty isn't about separation. It's about freedom with others. It's about relationships and communities where authenticity isn't punished, where we can bring our full selves without collapsing into conformity. Sovereignty is most powerful when it moves beyond the individual and reshapes the spaces we inhabit. Themes freedom together. Sovereignty flourishes when relationships honor difference rather than demand uniformity. Boundaries and bridges. Sovereignty means protecting your boundaries while still building bridges to others. Community of the real groups that allow sovereignty become deeper, truer, and more resilient. Resistance to collective masks. Societies thrive on performance scripts. Sovereign living resists those scripts and plants seeds of new possibilities. Attributes relational. Sovereignty is not withdrawal, but authentic presence with others. Respectful, it honors boundaries while allowing connection. Disruptive, it destabilizes groups and systems built on conformity. Generative, it creates the conditions for authentic community. Freedom together, I imagine sovereignty in a community like a circle of people, each with their own flame. No flame tries to outshine the others, and none are extinguished for being different. Together, the circle glows brighter, not because they burn the same, but because each burns true. Sovereignty reshapes how I see relationships. When I perform, I'm not really connecting. I'm offering only the mask. But when I live sovereign, the connection becomes real because it's rooted in truth. Communities often resist this. They reward performance, punish difference, and silence what unsettles. But I've also been in spaces, rare but unforgettable, where honesty was allowed, where masks weren't required. Those sovereign spaces were alive with trust. They weren't always comfortable, but they were real. Philosophically, this echoes Martin Buber's idea of I-thou relationships, encounters where we meet each other as whole beings, not as roles. To me, that's sovereignty in practice, freedom alive in connection. Personal reflection, I've experienced both sides of this. I've been in groups where performance was the currency. Everyone knew the lines, the posture, the right things to say. Belonging was there, but it was shallow, fragile, conditional, always one slip away from collapse. And I've also been in moments of rare, sovereign connection. Times when I spoke honestly and wasn't rejected, where someone else dropped their mask and trusted me with their truth. Those moments didn't just connect me to them, they reminded me of my own sovereignty. On the societal level, I've seen how governments, corporations, and cultural systems demand performance. They thrive on predictability, on people asleep in the script. But I've also seen and felt what happens when someone breaks the script. It creates ripples, it wakes others. Sovereignty is contagious. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, sovereignty changes intimacy. Psychologists speak of authentic relating, the idea that true intimacy begins where performance ends. For me, this has meant daring to bring my unpolished self into relationships, even at the risk of rejection. At the group level, sovereignty transforms community. Groups built on performance implode under pressure. Groups built on honesty bend without breaking. I've felt the energy shift when masks fall away, trust deepens, resilience grows, and connection becomes real. At the societal level, sovereignty becomes resistance. Systems depend on conformity to survive. A society of sovereign individuals cannot be controlled in the same way. That's why awakening is often treated as a threat. But it's also why sovereignty matters. It's how cultures shift, one person, one community at a time. For me, sovereignty has never meant standing apart from others. It has meant showing up as myself, and in doing so, inviting others to do the same. Embodiment prompt or practice picture one relationship where you feel the most pressure to perform. Imagine showing up sovereign, dropping the mask, speaking truth, and holding boundaries. Notice the fear that arises. Notice also the freedom. Insight prompt. Who in your life allows you to live sovereign, to be real without performance? And how might you create more of those connections? Integration moment sovereignty is not separation. It is the freedom to live unmasked, together. In a relationship, in a community, in society, sovereignty is both resistance and invitation, resistance to conformity and invitation to authenticity. Seed to plant sovereignty is freedom together. When we live unmasked, we make space for others to do the same. Sovereign living as path sovereignty isn't a single decision or a single awakening. It is a path, a way of walking through life with awareness, courage, and authenticity. Every time we drop a mask, resist a script, or speak truth when performance would be safer, we are practicing sovereignty. It is less about being supreme and more about being awake. Less about standing above and more about standing true. Theme sovereignty as ongoing. It is not a crown placed once, but a discipline practiced daily. Freedom over performance. Every moment offers a choice. Play the role or live awake. Courage as companion. Sovereignty isn't always comfortable, but it is always freeing. The path of the awakened. To live sovereign is to live awake in a world built to keep you asleep. Attributes ongoing. Sovereignty is renewed in each choice, not declared once for all. Courageous. It requires stepping into truth even when it costs belonging. Grounded. Sovereignty doesn't chase transcendence, but roots us in lived reality. Awakening. Each act of sovereignty keeps us awake in a culture of sleep. The unscripted life I picture sovereign living like walking without a script. No rehearsed lines, no stage directions, no performance cues. Each step is chosen, awake, unscripted, written only as I live it. What I've learned is that sovereignty doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in moments, in the quiet choice to say no, in the courageous act of speaking truth, in the simple refusal to stay asleep. Sovereignty is not perfection. I still feel the pull of performance, the temptation of masks, the comfort of belonging at the cost of self. But sovereignty is not about never slipping. It's about noticing when I do and choosing to return, to awaken again, to realign. Spiritually, sovereignty feels like the opposite of bypassing. Instead of reaching for light to escape the shadow, it accepts both. Instead of playing the role others hand me, it calls me to be present as I am. It is, in many ways, the path of the awakened, not leaving the world, but living more fully in it. Personal reflection. For me, sovereign living became real in the moments I realized I could no longer keep performing. I couldn't keep rehearsing the safe lines, couldn't keep accepting the masks handed to me by culture, by government, by institutions. My awakening showed me that sovereignty wasn't about rejecting everything outside of me, but about refusing to let it define me. It was about remembering that life is mine to live unscripted, unpolished, and awake. I've stumbled. I've slipped back into performance. But sovereignty has always been the path that calls me back. Not a crown above me, but a crown within me. Psychological and philosophical insight. At the individual level, sovereignty means choosing congruence, living in alignment with truth. I've seen how each small act of authenticity strengthens resilience, while every compromise for performance weakens it. Sovereignty is built in these micro-choices. At the group level, sovereignty transforms relationships and communities. When one person lives awake, others feel permission to do the same. This is how authentic spaces grow, not through grand declarations, but through lived examples. At the societal level, sovereignty is resistance. Systems thrive when people stay asleep, compliant, and performing. Sovereign individuals disrupt that pattern, not always loudly, sometimes simply by refusing to play along. Every act of honesty is a quiet rebellion. For me, sovereignty has never been about ruling others. It has always been about refusing to abandon myself. Embodiment prompt or practice. Place your hand on your chest. Whisper, "This life is mine to live." Breathe deeply. Whisper again, "I choose freedom over performance." Insight prompt. What is one area of your life where you're ready to stop performing and start living sovereignly? Integration moment sovereignty is not a crown we wear once, but a path we walk again and again. It is 1,000 small awakenings, a daily choosing of freedom over performance. A life-lived seed to plant sovereignty is the unscripted life. Each choice for authenticity is a step on the path. Walking the unscripted life sovereignty isn't a crown that others hand us. It's the crown within, discovered each time we choose freedom over performance, truth over illusion, authenticity over masks. For me, sovereign living has been a path of waking up from conditioning, from performance, from the sleep of scripts. It isn't perfect and it isn't easy, but it is real, and real has always been where freedom begins. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. As always, stay unfiltered, stay human, and keep walking unscripted. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, the Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, the Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of the Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse. A journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 the simulated self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 the spell of the mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 conscious seduction, journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 the myth of sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 the algorithmic mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 the noise of knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 belief machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 submerged signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 the alchemy within traces, food, frequency, and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20 encoded flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.